Hello, this is Elizabeth Creamer. I prepared a video to talk about qualitative approaches to grounded theory, and I want to talk about it both as a method and as a methodology. So those are really the two main points. I am a professor emerita from the School of Education at Virginia Tech, particularly and specifically the Educational Research Program. Let me just give you a brief idea of what I'm trying to accomplish today. I want to, of course, give you a basic definition. I want to distinguish it both as a method and a methodology. I want to give you some of a sense of the steps that are involved in using grounded theory methods, which are used in many different kinds of qualitative research approaches, as well as talking about what a grounded theory looks like when you're approaching it from a methodological perspective. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I came to Blacksburg, Virginia, where I am today. This is my home office because I retired after 36 years and a half, to be exact, as a full-time employee at Virginia Tech. I was been in both administrative and faculty roles. But since about 1995, I've been teaching graduate level courses in methodology, research methodology, and particularly in qualitative research, grounded theory approaches, and my true love is mixed methods research. So of course, I'm doing a little work with mixed methods and grounded theory. Originally, my interests were in gender issues and particularly issues related to women's involvement in science and engineering and technology. But for the last 10 years or so, I've really gotten into a focus on methodology, that is, how people do research, as compared to most of you who really have a content interest of how students learn, how teachers teach, strategies that improve health and well-being. So my interest has grown increasingly to pay attention to the methods themselves. So I'm becoming sort of a method geek, I guess. Creswell, who has a wonderful, straightforward book called An Introduction to Five Qualitative Traditions, which is a great basic text in addition to Corbin and Strauss, offers this definition of grounded theory. And really, I would define it as something that grounded theory methods or procedures are used to develop a grounded theory. So generally, the purpose of using grounded theory is to develop a theory inductively from the data. So that's quite different than taking a theory, generating hypotheses, and testing those hypotheses. That would not fit with the definition of grounded theory, which is that you create a theory from the data you collect. Those data historically have been thought of as qualitative data, but really it can be qualitative and quantitative data, and certainly neither Corbin or Strauss or Sharma, the most recent sort of leading voice in grounded theory, object to the idea that you could use, and very likely will use, both qualitative and quantitative data when you design your research. This approach is very compatible with what's called intervention research. Intervention research, the word doesn't seem right. Maybe evaluation would seem better. But in intervention research, you're interested in the impact of a course or an activity. You want to know if doing something leads to learning in a specific area, or if you were in the medical and health field, you're really interested in knowing if, for instance, this music therapy program could help people overcome chronic pain. That's just an example. So anything to do with advancing learning, thinking, well-being, health, programs designed to be very, very compatible with this particular qualitative approach. Other qualitative approaches that Creswell considers are case study, phenomenology, narrative inquiry, and I'm blanking, there's one more. So I think it's helpful to think of grounded theory, as I said, as a method, and by method I mean a set of procedures to collect and analyze data, but actually it's really mostly about analyzing data. That's the method part of it. And as a methodology, and I think the way to think of a methodology is as an overall set of assumptions, an overall logic. Like a narrative inquiry, you collect stories, you analyze them as stories, you keep them intact as a set of stories. In case study, it has its own logic and set of assumptions. That's its methodology. Neither case study nor narrative inquiry have a specific set of methods associated with it, because this grounded theory method of analyzing data is used with almost all qualitative traditions, whether it's case study, narrative, phenomenology, or grounded theory. So an overview of the methods, so they're procedures for data analysis, that begins with open coding and moves to focused and axial coding, and even more sophisticated types of coding called theoretical coding, which I won't get into. As a methodology, it's driven by this idea of an inductive logic. That's hypothesis generating versus hypothesis testing. It begins without presuppositions or hypothesis. So if you want to test a theory, you would never call it grounded theory, even if you were using qualitative methods. That would be like an oxymoron. It wouldn't fit the logic of the methodology. The endpoint, when you're thinking of it as a methodology, which I call big GT, is the endpoint is to generate an explanation. And actually in grounded theory, the belief is you can generate a causal explanation. So a causal explanation would be, why do some people learn when you use this teaching strategy? And why do some people not learn when you use this teaching strategy? Underneath there is what's called a causal mechanism. And that's the why that people learn. So it's not just what they learn, but that's why they learn. And that's moving the research from a simply descriptive realm to an analytical realm, which to me is the basis of all PhD research. It must be analytical. It can't simply be descriptive. I would not necessarily say that of master's research, however, or thesis. So at the core of grounded theory as a methodology, what I call big GT, is an interest in a social process, a temporal social process. So a temporal social process, let's just say, first of all, it's time. It has a point 1, as point 2, as a point 3. How do you teach someone to ride a bicycle? What do they do first? What do they, they drag their feet on the ground, or they use training wheels. What do they use? What's the second step? Dad and mom riding behind you. What's the third step? You can ride without dad and mom or without training wheels. I guess you can tell I have 2 granddaughters. One who's 5 and one who's 2.5. So this is a relevant topic. So underneath it is a social process. Adjusting to loss, adjusting to a disability, making a transition in a social setting as, say, an immigrant or refugee, that's a social process that you believe unfolds in steps. You first do this, and then you do this, and then you do that. That's what is meant by a temporal process. So underneath it, you're looking for sort of a sequence that has a beginning, a middle, and the end. That's another way to define a temporal process. That's core when big GT as a methodology is used. That's the core, that at the core you're studying a social process of change. So I'm calling my discussion today is qualitative grounded theory, because certainly I think it's possible, though certainly it's been done less, to think of grounded theory, of developing a grounded theory in a quant way. It's mostly been thought of in qual way because it's based on the perceptions of participants. And part of what distinguishes those is both this, particularly this analytical logic, that the quant approach to qual, which is not what I'm talking about, begins with that kind of hypothesis testing. It's confirmatory, sometimes expansionary. Maybe you don't even believe the theory, but you'd like to test it in a specific context, believing that you might add to that context. That's still sort of a confirmatory mindset, which is more strongly associated with quant than with qual. In qual, you've got this, and this isn't wrong, it doesn't produce numbers here, but you've got this inductive mindset. You generate it from the data. It's far more exploratory, it's far more word-based. And of course, in the mixed methods approach, you're interested in combining both words and numbers. Now, if we shift to thinking of what I call little gt, which is the steps that are used to analyze data in a grounded theory approach to analyzing data, it is fairly viewed fairly uniformly as first described by Corbin and Strauss, earlier by Glaser and Strauss. There is sort of an accepted set of procedures, a sequence that you go through. And I mentioned that Charmez is the newest voice on the scene, so to speak. I don't think you think of 206 as new, but she's the first to really bring a constructivist approach to grounded theory. And this is a figure she used, and you read it from the bottom up, of the key steps in developing a grounded theory and the key step in the procedures. Now, let me just punch those out to talk about these are sort of defining procedures that if you ever published in grounded theory and you called it grounded theory, people would be expecting this kind of language. She begins here from the bottom with what's called initial or open coding, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Memoing is a big part of that, and essentially those are sort of self-reflective memos, which can become data. Then you move into sort of a more focused coding, which collapses some of the initial coding into larger categories. And then something called theoretical sampling, where there's a phase later on that further pursues key constructs, and then ends up with a type of theoretical construct. She abandoned this figure in the later edition of her book, I think being reluctant to be this prescriptive, but I think nevertheless it's a good overview. So whether you're doing case study, or whether you're doing, I'm not sure about narrative inquiry, but if you're doing generic qualitative research, usually the first place you begin after your research questions and your problem statement and all of that, of course, is a preliminary procedure called open coding. And what I put here is a set of field notes from a student in a class, from my own qual class, formatted into a scene. This could be like a scene where you're observing a classroom. It's organized into incidents. She's described the setting here. And this is a strategy I use, which is to code or name what you're reading about. And I use the insert comment. And of course, this would be a lot easier if you use qualitative software. Open coding is descriptive. It's simply trying to label what a participant is saying in a very descriptive way. I prescribe that those be related to your research questions, and usually often, if it was in interview transcripts, it would be organized by research question. So you're really looking to code it relative to your research questions in a practical sense, in a very practical sense. This illustrates, and I don't have a full cite here, but this came from a journal on aging. And here you have the movement from an initial set of codes to larger categories. So, for example, in this particular study, which was about self-ratings of health of elderly minorities, see that little typo right there? These were the initial codes, and you can see they stick quite literally to the data. People said, I do not have a symptom. Some people said I had serious symptoms. Some people said they had good symptoms. Some people had bad symptoms. And they just created a category called physical health, diagnosis, and symptoms. Now, that's a very broad category, probably a little too broad. And then they have one that they called, which I think is probably a better one, called physical functioning. So this is the focused code. It becomes a category now. And these were the smaller sort of manifestations that led to the identification of the broader functioning. So someone says they can't eat, they can't get around, they can't take care of themselves, or they cannot take care of themselves. They call that by the larger category of physical functioning. So usually you code a small number of your data, whether it's observation or transcripts, for open coding. Then you move to this broader set of coding, which is a little more efficient and much less likely to be line by line. So we're talking about process issues here. We're talking about the method of grounded theory, the procedure used to analyze the data. Now, one of the things that distinguishes grounded theory from other types of qualitative research, case study, ethnography, that's the fifth one, phenomenology, is that it has a fairly high expectation for sample size. That's when you're doing it for purposes of developing theory. When you get into developing theory, because it's complex, because it recognizes contextual factors, you have many variables, you'll notice the expectation for sample size is quite a bit higher than you see, for instance, look in phenomenology, it's only 6 to 10. In case studies, individuals, Tedley and Tashikuri are saying you could, a reasonably strong study might only use 6 individuals or 4 organizations. So sample size is one of the things that's associated with the logic of a methodology, and it's a way that's used to judge quality. So when you violate these expectations, then you're inviting people to criticize your work before they even say what you have to say about it. I mentioned before that one of the unique features of grounded theory is a separate sort of sampling procedure called theoretical sampling. That's when you're thinking about what I call big GT, big methodology. And this is a stage where you purposely seek out a sample to test your emerging theory. So maybe you've come to the conclusion that these are the types of individuals that benefit from this activity, and these are the types of individuals that don't benefit. And you might want to pursue that sort of to see if that's really true by picking maybe a group of people that are neutral, or picking some type of sample that you could particularly pursue the sort of emerging theory you're developing. So it's almost a very specialized form of purposeful sampling. I mentioned the compatibility of grounded theory with both mixed methods and intervention research. I said that intervention research is really research about developing and testing a program, an activity, a course. In health, of course, it's some kind of, it could be a drug trial, it could be a way to try to get patients to use medication. So this slide talks a little bit about why that compatibility. Both are interested in outcomes, both are anticipated in outcome and unanticipated. Did they learn what you hoped they did? What else did they learn? In what ways did they change? But you're also interested in what kinds of things influence that. And that's why grounded theory and intervention research is very compatible, as is mixed methods, because outcome data can easily come from surveys, for example. So let me give you a generic set of research questions that are compatible with generating theory, which seems like something many people might imagine as being above them, but does the intervention result in changes in attitude and behaviors? Okay, most people are interested in that. Those are the outcomes. What strategies are associated with promoting those changes? In other words, I want people to learn certain math skills. What's happening in the classroom that's promoting that? It's not only the teacher-teacher interaction. The book may have something to do with it. The materials may have something to do with it. The class activities have something to do with it. Interactions with other students have to do with it, as does what happens at home. So see, that's a perfect fit there. Another question, so that gets to what are the other factors that are influencing the impact of the intervention. So it's not only that I've designed this wonderful intervention, but there's other things happening. What are they doing in reading, for example, or, other factors that are going on that can influence it. This is sort of a representation of what a theory looks like in the abstract. I'm only going to talk about this briefly, but I've mentioned that usually when you're interested in intervention, you want to know what the outcomes are. You can collect those data either qualitatively or quantitatively, or use both to figure out. You could observe changes, or you could ask students to complete checklists or patients to complete checklists, or they could complete a survey. Where did you see improvement? You're interested in the process and the steps people go through to achieve this outcome. You're interested in what qualities of the individual influence this. Do people with more math background do better in this particular setting? Do people who have had some experience with tinker toys, do they do better? And then also contextual. So when you're developing a generic theoretical model, the big GT, these are the variables that are produced in that particular model. So wrapping up, I want to go back to the point that I refer to little GT and big GT. And you use that designation, which I understand is also accepted among people who talk about grounded theory. There's a set of methods about how you analyze data, and there is the overall logic or set of assumptions about it, which is called big GT, or the methodology. So when you're talking about using grounded theory, you have to think, do I mean I use the analytical procedures that Sharmas describes, for example, to analyze my qualitative data? That's all? I never meant to develop theory? Then you're talking about little GT. If you're saying, now wait a minute, not only did I use grounded theory methods, little GT, but my purpose was to develop theory inductively, and I'm fitting those larger assumptions, then I'm using both little GT and big GT. But when you label your work and when you use the language, it's important to distinguish between the two. So finally, a little bit of humor here while we wrap up. I do have an author webpage on Amazon related to my book, which the cover is here. There's a little bio information, and I didn't know this until I looked at it recently, but blog posts from a web page that I maintain, which is called Mixed Methods Research in the News. So I hope this has given you a little bit of a brief overview. I refer you again to Creswell's book, 5 Traditions. He has a whole chapter and some examples of grounded theory methodology. Sharmas is the one to go to for grounded theory methods. Au revoir.